Some places don't call for help with a voice. They wait for someone who's willing to listen. Every morning at exactly 5:17, before the first light touched the ridge behind the pines, Shadow would rise from the wooden floor of the cabin without a sound, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, as if guided by something older than habit. Daniel Hayes noticed it the first time by accident, half awake beneath a wool blanket, listening to the quiet creak of the door easing open and the soft press of paws stepping into the cold. At first, he thought nothing of it. Dogs wandered. They chased scents, followed instincts, drifted into the woods, and came back when they were ready. But Shadow always came back the same way, at the same time, his breath steady, his amber eyes calm, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. It was the fourth morning when Daniel finally checked the clock. 5:17, the same minute, the same silence, the same quiet departure. By the seventh day, the pattern had settled into something undeniable. Shadow wasn't wandering. He was going somewhere. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a long stretch of forest in northern Montana, miles from the nearest paved road, where the air carried the scent of pine and cold earth even in early fall. Daniel had chosen the place for its quiet, for the way the world seemed to slow down out here, far from the noise that followed him home from places he no longer spoke about. At 40, he carried himself like a man who had learned to measure his words carefully, someone who had seen enough to understand that not everything needed to be said out loud. His days were simple now. Chop wood, fix what broke, watch the sky shift from gray to gold and back again. And always, Shadow at his side. The dog had been with him through more than Daniel cared to remember. A German shepherd with a coat of deep black and muted tan, ears sharp, eyes always watching, always listening. There was something different about him, something that went beyond training or instinct, something that made Daniel trust him in a way he couldn't quite explain. Still, Daniel ignored it. For 11 days, he let the pattern continue, telling himself it was nothing. That routine could form out here the same way it did anywhere else. But on the 12th morning, something changed. Shadow didn't just leave. He paused at the door, looking back over his shoulder, holding Daniel's gaze for a second longer than usual, as if waiting, not for permission, but for understanding. Daniel felt it then, a faint pull in his chest, the kind that didn't come from logic, but from memory. A feeling he had learned, long ago, not to ignore. By the 13th day, the quiet had grown heavier. When Shadow returned, his paws carried a trace of dark soil that didn't match the dry ground around the cabin. He moved slower, his tail low, his ears flicking at sounds Daniel couldn't hear. That evening, as the last light faded behind the trees and the wind slipped softly through the branches, Shadow sat by the door again, not lying down, not settling, just waiting, watching. And for the first time, Daniel realized something that settled deep into his bones. Whatever was out there, it wasn't random. And whatever Shadow had found, it had been waiting long before they arrived. The next morning, Daniel did not wait for the sound of the door. He was already awake, sitting at the edge of his bed with his boots on, the laces loosely tied as if he had not yet decided whether he was going anywhere at all. The cabin was still wrapped in that deep, pre-dawn quiet, the kind that made every small sound feel louder than it should be. When Shadow stood, Daniel watched him carefully this time, noting the way the dog paused again at the door, ears angled slightly forward, body still but alert, as if listening to something far beyond the walls. Daniel exhaled slowly and reached for his jacket, the heavy canvas one worn soft at the elbows, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke and cold mornings. "All right," he murmured, his voice low, almost lost in the room. "Let us see what you have been finding." The door opened with a quiet creak, and the air outside met them like a held breath finally released, crisp and sharp against the skin. Frost clung to the ground in thin silver layers, and the trees stood tall and silent, their branches barely moving in the early light. Shadow did not hesitate. He stepped forward onto the narrow trail that cut through the trees behind the cabin, his pace steady, deliberate, not the wandering gait of a dog chasing scents, but something more certain, more purposeful. Daniel followed a few steps behind, his boots pressing into the thin layer of frost, each step leaving a mark that faded slowly as the cold air settled around it. The trail was not long, maybe a quarter-mile at most, but it felt different this time, as if the space between the trees had shifted, closing in just enough to make him aware of every breath, every sound, every subtle movement of the wind brushing against the branches. After a few minutes, Shadow slowed. His tail lowered slightly, and his ears lifted higher, catching something Daniel still could not hear. Then he stopped. The place itself did not look like much at first. Just a small clearing where the trees pulled back in a loose circle, the ground uneven and marked by the faint remains of something that had once been there. At the center stood a tree, taller than the rest, its trunk darkened and scarred, as if it had been touched by fire long ago. The bark was rough, split in places, and the earth around its base looked darker than the surrounding soil, almost as if it held moisture long after the rest had dried. Shadow moved closer, his steps slowing until he reached the base of the tree. Then, just as Daniel had seen from a distance all those mornings, he sat. Not casually, not resting. He sat upright, his body still, his eyes fixed on a single point near the roots, as if the ground itself held his attention. Daniel approached carefully, his gaze shifting between the dog and the tree, searching for something obvious, something that would explain the quiet tension in the air. He crouched, brushing his gloved hand across the soil. It was softer than it should have been, loose in a way that did not match the rest of the clearing. He pressed down slightly, feeling the ground give beneath his palm, just enough to notice, not enough to understand. Shadow let out a low sound then, not quite a growl, not fear, but something deeper, something that seemed to rise from instinct. Rather than reaction, Daniel stilled, his hand resting against the earth as he listened, not to the forest, but to the absence of sound around them. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, almost too subtle to catch, he felt it. Not a movement, not a shift, but a quiet, steady firmness beneath the loose soil, something that did not belong to the forest floor. Something placed there, something waiting. Daniel drew his hand back slowly, his eyes narrowing as he looked at the base of the tree again, this time not as part of the landscape, but as something that had been chosen. Shadow remained still beside him, watching, patient in a way that made Daniel realize this was never about curiosity. It was about timing. And for the first time since he had followed the dog into the clearing, Daniel understood that whatever lay beneath that ground had not been calling loudly. It had simply been waiting for someone who would finally choose to listen. Daniel did not speak right away. He remained crouched at the base of the tree, his hand hovering just above the soil, as if touching it again too quickly might disturb whatever fragile truth lay beneath. The air in the clearing felt different now, heavier, as though the forest itself had shifted its attention toward this single spot. Shadow stayed exactly where he was, seated and unwavering, his gaze locked on the ground with a patience that carried no doubt, only quiet certainty. Daniel reached forward again, slower this time, brushing aside a thin layer of loose dirt with the back of his glove. The soil gave easily, too easily for ground that had not been disturbed in years. Beneath the top layer, the texture changed. It became firmer, smoother, and unmistakably deliberate. He paused, his fingers tracing the edge of something just beneath the surface, something that did not belong to roots or stone. A shape, flat, defined. He cleared more dirt away, working carefully, letting the outline reveal itself instead of forcing it. Within minutes, a narrow rectangle began to emerge, its edges straight, its corners sharp in a way nature rarely allowed. The color was muted beneath the soil, a dull gray that caught the faint morning light in a way that made it almost blend into the earth. Metal. Daniel leaned back slightly, his breath steady but deeper now, as if something inside him had recognized the moment before his mind had caught up. He had seen this before, not here, not in this forest, but in places where the ground hid more than just time. Places where what was buried had been meant to stay hidden until someone knew exactly where to look. Shadow shifted then, just a small movement, his front paw pressing lightly against the edge of the exposed surface. Not scratching, not digging, just touching, as if confirming what Daniel had begun to uncover. Daniel nodded faintly, more to himself than to the dog, and reached for the small folding shovel strapped to his pack. The metal clicked softly as he opened it, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. He worked around the edges, widening the space, careful not to strike too hard, careful not to rush. Dirt gave way inch by inch, revealing more of the object beneath. It was larger than he first thought, maybe 3 feet across, set just deep enough to avoid detection, but not so deep that it could never be found. After several minutes, the full outline came into view. A hatch, rectangular, solid, built with purpose. Along one side, partially obscured by compacted soil, he found a hinge, rusted but intact. On the opposite side, a recessed handle, worn smooth as if it had once been used more than once, more than twice. Daniel sat back on his heels, the shovel resting across his knees as he studied it. The forest around him remained silent. No wind moving through the branches, no distant calls from birds. Just that same quiet that had followed him since he stepped into the clearing. He placed his hand flat against the metal surface. It was cold, but not with the biting chill of morning air. It held a deeper kind of cold, the kind that came from being untouched for a very long time. For a moment, he closed his eyes. Not in fear, not in hesitation, but in recognition. There had been times, years ago, when he had learned to trust signals that did not make sense at first, to act on instinct before logic had time to interfere. Those moments had not always been easy, but they had always mattered. When he opened his eyes again, he did not question why he was here or why Shadow had led him to this place. He only understood one thing with quiet clarity. This had not been left behind by accident. And whatever waited beneath that hatch had been waiting for someone who would finally choose to open it. Daniel did not rush. His hand remained on the cold metal for a long moment, as if listening through his palm, as if the silence beneath the hatch carried something that could be understood if he only stayed still long enough. The forest held its breath around him, and even the faint morning light seemed to pause at the edges of the clearing, unwilling to fully cross into the space they had uncovered. Shadow rose slowly from his seated position and stepped closer, his movements measured, his body angled toward the hatch with quiet focus. He lowered his head, sniffing once near the edge, then lifted his gaze back to Daniel, his amber eyes steady, not anxious, not afraid, just certain. Daniel gave a small nod, the kind shared between partners who had learned to trust without needing words. He shifted forward and brushed away the last of the soil from the recessed handle, clearing it enough to fit his fingers beneath the worn edge. The metal felt firm, resistant at first, as though it had settled into the earth over years of stillness. But when he applied steady pressure, it gave with a low, muted sound, a deep groan that seemed to echo faintly beneath the ground. The hatch lifted only an inch before stopping, the hinge protesting softly, not with force, but with the weight of time. Daniel adjusted his grip, setting his boots more firmly into the soil, and lifted again, slower this time, allowing the motion to unfold rather than forcing it open. The hatch rose gradually, revealing a narrow gap of darkness beneath, a space that swallowed the light rather than reflected it. A faint, cool air drifted upward, carrying with it a subtle scent, not decay, not dampness, but something older, something like stone and stillness, as if the space below had been sealed away from the world for a very long time. Daniel held the hatch open with one hand and leaned slightly forward, peering into the opening. At first, there was nothing to see, only shadow layered over shadow, but as his eyes adjusted, a shape began to form. Steps, narrow, descending into the earth at a gentle angle, each one lined with the same dull metal as the hatch, leading downward into a space that curved out of sight. He let out a slow breath, the sound barely audible, and for a moment, the memory of other stairways flickered at the edges of his mind, places where going down had meant uncertainty, where each step carried weight beyond the physical. But this felt different. There was no urgency here, no threat pressing forward, only a quiet invitation, as if the space below had been waiting patiently, without expectation, without demand. Shadow moved again, stepping to the edge of the opening, his ears tilted forward, his posture alert but calm. He did not bark. He did not retreat. Instead, he placed one paw gently onto the first step, testing it, feeling its stability, then looked back at Daniel once more. The gesture was simple, but it carried meaning Daniel understood clearly. This was not something to fear. This was something to follow. Daniel reached back toward his pack and pulled out a small flashlight, clicking it on and angling the beam downward. The light cut through the darkness in a narrow line, revealing more of the staircase, the clean edges of each step, the absence of debris, the careful construction that spoke of intention rather than abandonment. He swept the beam slowly, and for a brief moment, something at the bottom caught the light, a faint reflection, something metallic or glass, too far to identify, but enough to confirm that the space below was not empty. Daniel straightened, his grip still firm on the hatch, and looked once more at the clearing around him, at the quiet trees, the pale morning sky, the place that had seemed so ordinary only minutes before. Then he looked down again, into the opening, into the unknown that no longer felt entirely unfamiliar. Shadow waited on the first step, steady and patient, as if he had always known this moment would come. And with a final, quiet breath, Daniel shifted his weight forward, placing his boot onto the top step, not with hesitation, but with the calm acceptance of someone who had learned that sometimes the only way to understand what is waiting is to take the first step toward it. The first step carried a weight that was not physical but remembered, a quiet echo of every moment Daniel had ever chosen to move forward when standing still would have been easier. And as his boots settled onto the metal, the faint sound it made seemed to travel farther than it should, slipping into the space below and returning softened, as if the air itself absorbed it. Shadow moved ahead without hesitation, descending one step at a time with the same calm precision he had shown outside, his body low but steady, his ears angled forward, listening to something deeper than sound. Daniel followed, his hand brushing lightly against the wall as he moved, feeling the surface beside him, smooth in some places, rough in others, but always deliberate, always shaped by intent rather than time alone. The beam from his flashlight cut a narrow path downward, revealing the continuation of the steps, each one evenly spaced, each one leading deeper into a space that felt less like a tunnel and more like a passage that had been built with care, with patience, with a purpose that had not been rushed. The air grew cooler as they descended, but not cold in a way that bit at the skin. Instead, it carried a stillness that settled into the lungs, quiet and steady, like a place untouched by the rhythm of the outside world. After what felt like more steps than the distance should have allowed, the staircase began to level out, opening into a small chamber carved into the earth, its ceiling just high enough for Daniel to stand without lowering his head. He stepped onto the flat surface at the bottom and paused, letting his eyes adjust beyond the narrow beam of light, letting the space reveal itself slowly rather than forcing it into clarity. The room was not large, perhaps 10 feet across, but everything within it felt arranged rather than abandoned, as if the passage of time had not erased its purpose but preserved it. Along one wall, a simple, wooden shelf held a few objects, their shapes softened by dust but not lost to it. A canteen, old but intact, a folded piece of fabric, and beside them, a small metal box no larger than a lunch pail. Opposite the shelf stood a narrow table, its surface worn but stable, and on it rested something that caught the light in a way that drew Daniel's attention immediately. A journal. Its cover was dark, edges frayed, the spine cracked just enough to suggest it had been opened many times before being left here. Shadow moved into the room and stopped near the table, his nose lowering slightly as he inhaled, then lifting again as he turned his head toward Daniel, his posture easing, as if whatever tension had guided him here had now found its answer. Daniel stepped closer to the table, each movement careful, not out of fear, but out of respect for the quiet that filled the space. He reached out and placed his hand gently on the journal, feeling the texture of the worn cover beneath his fingers. It was not damp. It was not brittle. It felt preserved, protected in a way that did not come from chance. He opened it slowly, the pages shifting with a soft whisper, and the beam of his flashlight settled across the first lines of handwriting. The letters were steady, deliberate, written by someone who had taken their time, someone who had expected these words to be read. Daniel leaned in slightly, his eyes tracing the ink, and for a moment, the world above the ground, the cabin, the forest, the quiet life he had built, all of it faded to the edges of his awareness. Because the name written at the top of the page was not unfamiliar. It was not distant. It was not a stranger's story waiting to be told. It was a name he had not spoken in years, a name he had carried silently through time, believing it belonged only to memory. And as he stood there in that hidden room beneath the earth, with Shadow beside him and the quiet pressing gently around them, Daniel understood that whatever this place had been meant to hold, It had not been left behind for just anyone to find. It had been left for him. Daniel did not turn the page right away. His eyes remained fixed on the name, tracing each letter slowly, as if the act of reading it too quickly might break whatever fragile connection had just been restored. The sound of his own breathing seemed louder in the small chamber, steady but heavier now, carrying the weight of something he had not expected to find again. Shadow settled beside the table, lowering himself onto the cool ground. His body relaxed in a way Daniel had not seen since before they entered the clearing, as if the purpose that had guided him here had finally been fulfilled. The beam of the flashlight trembled slightly as Daniel adjusted his grip, not from fear, but from the quiet shift happening inside him, the kind that did not come all at once, but unfolded slowly, piece by piece. He exhaled, long and measured, and let his gaze move down to the first line beneath the name. The handwriting was familiar, not because he had seen it often, but because memory had a way of holding on to small details long after everything else had faded. It carried the same steady rhythm, the same careful spacing, the same quiet discipline he remembered from years ago. The first sentence was simple, almost understated, but it settled into him with a clarity that left no room for doubt. It was not a message meant for anyone. It was meant for him. Daniel lowered himself onto the edge of the chair beside the table, the wood creaking softly under his weight, and began to read. The words did not rush. They unfolded slowly, line by line, written with the kind of patience that came from someone who knew time might be limited, but purpose was not. The journal spoke of a journey that had not ended where Daniel believed it had, of a path that had diverged quietly, without announcement, without explanation. There were no dramatic details, no urgency in the tone, only a calm acknowledgement of what had been and what had come after. The writer described finding this place, this hidden room beneath the tree, not by accident, but by following a pattern much like the one Shadow had shown, a series of small signs that only made sense once they were trusted. Daniel's grip tightened slightly on the edge of the page as he read further, the realization settling deeper with each line. This had not been a random discovery. It had been chosen, prepared, and left behind with intention. The journal described days spent in the chamber, not in isolation, but in reflection, in the quiet rebuilding of something that had once been lost. There were notes about the forest above, the way the light filtered through the branches at different times of day, the way the air shifted just before sunrise, the same hour Shadow had begun his daily walks. Daniel paused there, his eyes lifting briefly from the page, the connection forming without effort. This place had been observed, understood, lived in. And then, at some point, it had been left behind. He turned the page carefully, the paper moving with a soft, dry sound, and continued reading. The tone shifted slightly, not in urgency, but in depth, as if the writer had reached the part of the story that mattered most. There were reflections now, not just on what had happened, but on what it had meant, on the choices that had been made and the ones that had been left undone. And then, near the center of the page, a line that caused Daniel to still completely. It was not long. It was not complicated, but it carried a weight that reached through years of silence and settled directly into the space he had kept closed. The words spoke of waiting, not in the sense of time passing, but in the sense of trust, of believing that one day, the right person would stand in this exact place, at the exact moment they were ready to understand. Daniel's hand rested flat against the open journal, his fingers pressing lightly into the page as if grounding himself in the present. He did not question how or why anymore. He did not search for explanation, because the truth, quiet and steady, had already made itself known. This was never about finding something hidden. It was about being led back to something that had never truly been lost. Daniel remained seated for a long time, the journal opened beneath his hand, the quiet of the chamber settling deeper around him like something that had been waiting not just to be found, but to be felt. The words lingered in his mind even after his eyes stopped moving across the page, each sentence carrying a familiarity that was difficult to explain, as if he was not reading something new, but remembering something he had once known and somehow forgotten. Shadow shifted slightly beside him, letting out a slow breath before resting his head on his front paws, his body fully at ease now, as if the tension that had guided him here had finally dissolved into something calmer, something complete. Daniel glanced at the dog for a moment, studying the quiet rise and fall of his chest, the steady presence that had never once faltered, not in the years behind them, and not in the moments that had led them here. He reached out briefly, his hand brushing against Shadow's neck, a small gesture, but one that carried more meaning than words ever could. Then his attention returned to the journal. He turned another page, slower this time, aware that each line was bringing him closer to something final, something that had been left unfinished until now. The handwriting remained steady, but there was a subtle shift in tone, a quiet sense of closure woven between the lines, as if the writer had known this part would be the last to be read. There were fewer descriptions now, fewer observations about the place itself, and more reflection, more intention behind each word. It spoke of choices not as regrets, but as paths that had led to understanding, of distance not as loss, but as something necessary for clarity to take shape. Daniel read carefully, his eyes tracing each sentence with a focus that shut out everything else, the world above, the passage of time, even the sound of his own breathing. And then he reached the final entry. It was shorter than the others, but it carried a weight that seemed to fill the entire room. The words were simple, direct, written without hesitation. They spoke of leaving this place not because it had lost its purpose, but because its purpose had been fulfilled. They spoke of trust, not in chance, but in the belief that one day, someone would stand where Daniel was standing now, someone who would understand not just what had been left behind, but why it had been left at all. Daniel's gaze held on the last line longer than the rest. It was not a farewell. It was not an ending. It was something quieter, something that felt more like a passing of responsibility, a continuation rather than a conclusion. Slowly, he closed the journal, his hand resting on the worn cover for a moment before he lifted it carefully from the table. The weight of it felt balanced, grounded, as if it belonged in his hands now in a way it had not before. He stood, the chair shifting softly behind him, and took a slow breath, letting it settle fully before he moved. Around him, the chamber remained unchanged, still and patient, the objects on the shelf undisturbed, the air holding that same quiet steadiness. But something within it had shifted, not in the space itself, but in what it now meant. Daniel turned toward the staircase, the narrow path leading back to the surface, to the world above that suddenly felt different, not because it had changed, but because he had. Shadow rose without being called, falling into step beside him, his presence as steady as ever. As Daniel placed his foot on the first step, the journal held securely in one hand, he paused for just a second, glancing back at the room one last time. There was no sense of leaving something behind, only the quiet understanding that whatever had waited here had now found its way forward. And as he began to climb, step by step, the light above growing slightly brighter with each movement, Daniel carried with him not just the words he had read, but the certainty that some things are not meant to be discovered by chance, but return to when the time is finally right. The moment Daniel pushed the hatch open from below, the morning light poured in like something returning, soft but certain, stretching across the edges of the metal and spilling down the first few steps, as if it had been waiting just beyond reach. The air above felt different now, warmer, carrying the faint scent of pine and frost melting into the earth. He stepped out slowly, his boots finding the ground of the clearing again, the same place that had looked so ordinary before now holding a quiet weight that could not be unseen. Shadow followed close behind, emerging into the light without hesitation, his posture calm, his gaze sweeping the trees once before settling back on Daniel, as if to confirm that what needed to be done had been done. Daniel lowered the hatch carefully, guiding it back into place with a steady hand, not to hide it again, but to protect what remained beneath, to keep it as it had been left, undisturbed, respected. The metal settled into the earth with a muted sound, blending once more into the forest floor, leaving only the faint outline that only someone who knew where to look would ever notice. For a moment, Daniel stood there, the journal held firmly in his hand, his eyes tracing the clearing, the tall tree at its center, the quiet arrangement of space that now felt less like coincidence and more like intention. The forest around him had begun to wake. A distant breeze moved through the branches, carrying with it the soft rustle of leaves, and somewhere beyond the trees, a bird called once, then again, as if marking the return of something that had been still. Daniel took a slow breath, letting the air fill his lungs, grounding himself in the present, in the place that had shifted without changing at all. He turned slightly, looking toward the narrow trail that led back to the cabin, the path now clearer in his mind than it had ever been before. But he did not move right away. Instead, he walked a few steps closer to the base of the tree, his gaze lowering to the ground where the soil had been disturbed. He knelt briefly, brushing his hand across the surface, smoothing the earth not to erase what had happened, but to leave it as it had been meant to be, quiet, unmarked, waiting. Shadow stood beside him, watching, his tail low and still, his presence steady in a way that felt less like companionship and more like understanding. Daniel rose again, the journal shifting slightly in his grip, and for a moment, he opened it once more, just enough to see the final page. The words were still there, unchanged, but something about them felt different now, not because they had changed, but because he had stepped through them, carried them with him, allowed them to become part of what came next. He closed the journal gently and tucked it inside his jacket, close to his chest, where it rested not as an object, but as something carried forward. When he finally turned toward the trail, his steps were unhurried, measured, the same way they had always been, but with a quiet difference that could not be seen from the outside. Shadow moved beside him, matching his pace without needing direction, his ears relaxed now, his focus no longer fixed on a single point, but open, aware, complete. The path back to the cabin stretched ahead through the trees, the light growing stronger as the sun rose higher, touching the tops of the branches and filtering down in soft patterns that shifted with each step. Daniel did not look back again, not because he wanted to forget, but because there was nothing left behind to return to. Everything that had been waiting beneath that tree had already found its way with him. And as he walked, the quiet understanding settled deeper with each step, simple and steady, that some places are not meant to be discovered and left unchanged, but to be carried forward, not in the ground where they were hidden, but in the lives of those who were finally ready to receive them. By the time Daniel reached the cabin, the sun had climbed just high enough to warm the edges of the clearing beyond the trees, casting long lines of light across the ground that shifted gently with the breeze. The familiar structure stood exactly as it had the day before, weathered wood, quiet windows, a place built for stillness. Yet something within it felt different now, not because anything had changed, but because he had returned carrying something he had not known he was missing. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking softly beneath his boots, and paused for a moment before opening the door, his hand resting lightly against the worn handle as if acknowledging the threshold between what had been and what now was. Shadow moved ahead of him, slipping inside with the same calm presence, circling once before settling near the hearth, his body lowering into a position of quiet rest that spoke not of exhaustion, but of completion. Daniel closed the door behind them, the soft click echoing gently through the room, and stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle around him once more. It was the same silence he had lived with for months, but it no longer felt empty. It felt full, not with noise, but with something steadier, something that did not demand attention, only recognition. He removed his jacket slowly and set it over the back of a chair, then reached inside and pulled out the journal, holding it carefully as he moved to the small wooden table by the window. The light there was soft, filtered through the glass in a way that made everything seem a little clearer, a little more grounded. He placed the journal down and opened it again, not to search, not to question, but simply to read, to sit with the words now that he understood them differently. Hours passed without measure, the sun shifting across the floor, the shadows moving in quiet patterns that marked time without urgency. Shadow remained where he was, occasionally lifting his head, his eyes tracking the movement of light, then settling again, content in the stillness. Daniel read every page, slowly, deliberately, allowing each line to settle fully before moving to the next. There were no instructions written in the journal, no directions to follow, no clear path laid out beyond what had already been revealed. What it offered was something quieter, something that could not be handed over directly. Understanding, a sense of continuity, a reminder that what had been carried through silence did not have to remain there. When he reached the final page again, he did not linger this time. He closed the journal gently and rested his hand on its cover, his gaze lifting toward the window where the forest stretched beyond, unchanged, and yet entirely different in the way he now saw it. The place beneath the tree was no longer just a hidden chamber. It was part of something larger, something that did not end with discovery, but began with it. Daniel stood and moved to the door, opening it to let the afternoon air drift inside. The scent of pine and earth filled the room, carrying with it the quiet rhythm of the world beyond the walls. He stepped outside again, shadow rising to follow, his paws light against the wood as he joined him on the porch. Together, they stood for a moment, looking out toward the trees, toward the path that now held meaning far beyond distance. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders easing in a way they had not in years, the weight he had carried shifting, not disappearing, but finding a place where it no longer pressed against him. He glanced down at Shadow, offering a small nod, a quiet acknowledgement of the path that had been walked, the one that had been revealed, and the one that now stretched ahead. The forest did not call out. It did not need to, because some truths do not arrive with sound or urgency. They arrive in stillness, in patience, in the quiet certainty that what is meant to be found will wait as long as it needs to. And as Daniel stood there, the light settling around him, the wind moving gently through the trees, he understood something with a clarity that required no explanation. He had not been led to something hidden. He had been led back to something that had always known he would return.